Our existence is a miracle born from the ashes of chaos and nothingness. We are bipedal mammals with huge brains, capable of reshaping the world around us. But if we could turn back time, we would find ourselves in a story so incredible that it defies common sense. Every breath we take for granted today, every blink of the eyes, every movement of the hand, emotion, or word, is the result of countless catastrophes, coincidences, mutations, and happy turns in an infinitely long evolutionary game. In the very beginning, we were just dust in space. The Earth was hell, a fireball where life had no chance. And yet, somewhere between the bang of lightning and the vibration of chemical reactions, something happened that changed the course of history. Out of blind chaos was born the first glimpse of life, a single cell that learned to copy itself. And it was there that the journey began that ended with us after billions of years. In that story, death is commonplace, extinction more common than survival, and chance more powerful than plan. The story of human creation is deeper than the sea, wider than the sky, and wilder than anything we can imagine. And yet, here we are, deep in time, when the Earth was still blazing like a red-hot ball of lava. Everything we know today as life was completely non-existent. The surface of the planet was inhospitable, dominated by volcanic eruptions, deadly radiation, and toxic gases. However, in this absolutely unforgiving landscape, thanks to an extremely rare series of events, something incredible happened. Asteroids or comets delivered water and organic compounds to Earth. When billions of volts of lightning struck this chemical soup, the atoms came together exactly the way they were supposed to. Genetic chains were born. These fragile molecules themselves were not stable enough until they were surrounded by an oily capsule. This primitive membrane protected the genetic information so much that it could perform a miracle for the first time, to copy itself. And at that moment, approximately 3.5 billion years ago, life arose. A single cell, the first form of life, is our most distant ancestor. Every person, every animal, every tree, every insect. We all come from this one event. After more than 2 billion years, when the oceans were home exclusively to simple single-celled organisms, evolution intervened quite randomly again. The two cells fused to form a hybrid with the genetic material of the two original cells. This coincidence, which could be dismissed as insignificant, started something revolutionary: sexual reproduction. The new cells carried genes from two sources, leading to genetic variability. This became the driving force behind further development. Every mutation, every error in the transmission of genetic information meant the possibility of a new trait, a new adaptation. This is how a huge tree of life began to emerge, branching into billions of different forms, most of which no longer exist today. Yet one of these bold new directions led to us. From light, darkness, and chemical mistakes, a force was born that made possible an incredible diversity of life, and at the same time prepared the ground for the first primitive animals. Initially, all organisms were blind, living in the darkness of the oceans, unable to distinguish day from night. But then another mutation occurred. Several skin cells gained the ability to perceive light. This simple difference meant a huge advantage. It was possible to find food, avoid predators, survive longer, and produce more offspring. Eyes have evolved over millions of generations and have become one of nature's most complex and effective tools. At the same time, the first nerve centers were formed behind these eyes, clusters of cells capable of responding to stimuli. The brain was formed. In an ancient sea creature called Mylloconia, a distant ancestor of fish, the brain first began to perform functions such as decision-making and analysis of simple information. But in this world full of terrifying predators like Anomalosauries, the chances of survival were close to zero. Yet it is precisely because of these changes that we have embarked on a path that eventually created humans from fish. About 365 million years ago, one of the greatest dramas in the history of life took place. Some fish, driven into shallow, stagnant waters with low oxygen content, had to either die or find a way to breathe the oxygen of the air. Evolution offered a solution: lungs. Thanks to this modification, an ancient creature named Ichthyostega became the first amphibian that could breathe both underwater and on land. However, Stepping ashore meant facing new dangers. The sun was burning, the skin was drying, the terrain was sharp and merciless. Nevertheless, the body began to adapt. The skin became thicker, and strong limbs with claws developed, which allowed movement on land. This moment, when the creature first climbed out of the water onto land, was the beginning of a journey that led to mammals, primates, and finally to us. Life on land brought new challenges. Above all, the question of reproduction. Eggs that were laid in an environment without water had to be protected from drying out. Evolution responded by inventing a hard eggshell that kept the fetus inside while isolating it from the outside world. In order to fertilize the egg, it had to happen before the shell was formed, inside the female's body. And so, sexual intercourse as we know it today was born. This method of reproduction offered new possibilities, higher genetic diversity, and a better chance of survival of the offspring. However, a particularly exceptional turning point came with the advent of mammals. Instead of laying eggs, the new creatures began to specialize in giving birth to live young. An even bigger leap forward was the feeding of offspring with breast milk. The sweat glands on the female's abdomen gradually transformed into mammary glands, creating a completely new way of caring for the young. This model allowed for longer and more intensive care, opening the way for social bonding, intelligent behavior, and brain development. It is here that the rise of the group to which we, mammals, belongs, begins. 65 million years ago, a catastrophe of biblical proportions struck the Earth. A giant asteroid struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, plunging the planet into darkness. Dust and ash covered the sky, plants stopped growing, temperatures dropped, and food chains collapsed. The dinosaurs, which had ruled the Earth for more than 165 million years, became extinct one by one. And while the bodies of the giant lizards collapsed to the ground, the small, inconspicuous creatures survived, in holes, at night, on insects and debris. One of these survivors was a creature called Purgatorius, a small insectivorous mammal, a distant relative of today's primates. He had sharp senses, the ability to react quickly, and above all, a brain that made him exceptional. It was thanks to this period of darkness and destruction that mammals were given a chance to occupy vacant places in ecosystems. The catastrophe that ended the reign of the dinosaurs became the beginning of something new, the story of man. As the planet recovered from the disaster, its ecosystems began to change. The trees grew, fruit appeared on the branches, and new life found its place high above the ground. Mammals began to adapt to life in the treetops. The evolution was directed towards better balance, flexible fingers, and the ability to catch and hold food. This is how a new group was formed: primates, small, agile, with improved eyesight, learning, and communication skills. One of these first primates was the Alteolus, which lived about 56 million years ago. He jumped from tree to tree, ate fruit, and his brain began to process information in a more complex way. We could already see familiar features in his face today: forward-facing eyes, developed fingers and nails instead of claws. It was the beginning of an intelligence that would manifest itself more and more after millions of years. One of the most significant events in human evolution was the transition to walking on two legs. About 4 million years ago, the climate in East Africa began to change. Dense forests gave way to open plains, and food became scarcer. Our ancestors, such as Ardipithecus ramidus, were faced with a choice: to stay in the trees or venture into the unknown. And that's when they took an incredible step. Literally, they began to move upright, slowly and unsteadily at first, but over time their skeleton adapted. The pelvis narrowed, the spine arched, the feet gained an arch. The hands were freed from movement and were free to be manipulated. This change had a huge impact. By walking on two limbs, our ancestors got more food, avoided predators more easily, and were able to move more efficiently. What started as a necessity soon became our nature. The brain is the most complex organ in nature, and its growth has been at the center of human development. As our ancestors became smarter, so did their lifestyles. More than 2 million years ago, the species Homo habilis appeared, the first of the genus Homo. These ancient relatives of ours no longer survived passively. They began to actively create tools from stone. The sharp edges allowed them to break bones and obtain calorie-dense marrow, which dramatically improved their diet. It was this change that had a profound impact on brain development. Higher energy intake allowed for further growth of brain tissue, which in turn led to better thinking, planning, and cooperation. The skill of grasping, shaping, and using objects was at the beginning of technology, an ability that will be one of the greatest strengths of our species for millions of years. One of the most significant events in human evolution was the transition to walking on two legs. About 4 million years ago, the climate in East Africa began to change. Dense forests gave way to open plains and food became scarcer. Our ancestors, such as Ardipithecus ramidus, were faced with a choice: to stay in the trees or venture into the unknown. And that's when they took an incredible step, literally. They began to move upright, slowly and unsteadily at first, but over time their skeleton adapted. The pelvis narrowed, the spine arched, the feet gained an arch. The hands were freed from movement and were free to be manipulated. This change had a huge impact. By walking on two limbs, our ancestors got more food, avoided predators more easily, and were able to move more efficiently. What started as a necessity soon became our nature. The brain is the most complex organ in nature, and its growth has been at the center of human development. As our ancestors became smarter, so did their lifestyles. More than 2 million years ago, the species Homo habilis appeared, the first of the genus Homo. These ancient relatives of ours no longer survived passively. They began to actively create tools from stone. The sharp edges allowed them to break bones and obtain calorie-dense marrow, which dramatically improved their diet. It was this change that had a profound impact on brain development. Higher energy intake allowed for further growth of brain tissue, which in turn led to better thinking, planning, and cooperation. The skill of grasping, shaping, and using objects was at the beginning of technology, an ability that will be one of the greatest strengths of our species for millions of years. With tools in hand and brains in our heads, we set out on a journey that led not only to survival, but to world domination. About 1.5 million years ago, a new species of man appeared, Homo erectus. He was no longer just a gatherer or an occasional scavenger. He became an active hunter who was able not only to catch prey, but also to kill and process it. The key to success was not strength, but endurance. While antelopes and gazelles could run fast, humans ran longer. Thanks to his physical modifications, longer legs, firm hips, and effective sweat cooling, he became a marathoner on the African plains. Exhausted, he chased the animal, which was then unable to defend itself. But an even more fundamental step was to tame the fire. The flames provided warmth, light, and protection from nocturnal predators, but above all, they made it possible to cook meat. Cooked food was easier to digest and less energy-intensive to process. This allowed the jaws to become weaker, freeing up space for further brain growth. Homo erectus thus became not only physically stronger, but also mentally more capable. The first basic forms of family and social life began to form around the fire, sharing food, caring for the young, cooperation. On the way to modern man, there were few inventions more important than language. Communication through articulated sounds, not just gestures and shouts, was a revolution. With the development of the larynx and the displacement of the tongue lower in the throat, our ancestors acquired the ability to form different sounds. This physiological adjustment opened the door to articulate speech. Language has made it possible to transmit complex ideas, warn of dangers, tell stories, share experiences, and build culture. Traditions, knowledge, and the first forms of identity were created thanks to words. Companies that were able to communicate better had an advantage. They were better able to cooperate in hunting, organize groups, resolve conflicts without violence, and raise offspring more effectively. Language was not only a survival tool, but also a building block of what we now call humanity. It has enabled us to begin to understand ourselves, to pass on wisdom to future generations, and to connect into larger wholes. After 3 billion years of evolutionary trial and error, a species was born that we now call Homo sapiens, the wise man. This new creature had a larger brain than any other species before it, and it could handle complex thinking, planning, and abstraction. He knew not only how to make instruments, but also how to improve them. He was able to talk, collaborate, and adapt to any environment, from the African savannas to the icy tundras. He was a creature that no longer created only objects, but also art, faith, and society. Thanks to its ability to adapt, Homo sapiens spread to all continents. The first human cultures were created, the first settlements, a sense of family, rules, identity, but most importantly, consciousness. People began to think about themselves, about death, about the future. The story of man thus ceased to be just a story of survival and became a story of the search for meaning. Hunters and gatherers became builders, philosophers, painters, scientists. From a simple mammal, it became the most complex creature ever to walk the earth. More than 10,000 years ago, our ancestors took another crucial step. After millions of years spent on the road as hunters and gatherers, some of them decided to settle down. They discovered that seeds that they had previously only collected could be planted and grown. The cultivation of cereals and legumes has radically changed people's lives. It was no longer necessary to constantly migrate in search of food. Instead, people could stay in one place and create permanent settlements. This change in livelihoods has brought population growth, but also new challenges. With the emergence of surpluses came the need to store and protect them. The first forms of property, commerce, social hierarchy, and specialization of work emerged. Some cultivated the fields, others built houses, others took care of security. This began a new chapter in human history, a chapter in which instead of nature, our species began to dominate the environment around it. With the development of agriculture, some settlements began to grow rapidly. A few huts became villages, villages became cities, and cities became the first civilizations. The oldest known cities, such as Jericho or Çatalhöyük, were founded more than 9,000 years ago. People lived in close contact, traded, built walls, worshipped deities, and faced the challenges of living together in larger communities. This development necessitated the emergence of rules and organization. The first forms of administration and government were born. When it is necessary to build an irrigation system or protect a city from raids, natural authority alone is no longer enough. People begin to choose leaders, hierarchies, laws, and troops are formed. Specialized craftsmen, artists, clergymen also appear in the cities. Civilization is becoming not only about survival, but about creating values, culture, memory, and progress. As society becomes more complex, the spoken word is no longer enough. People need to record who owns what, how much harvest has been stored, who owes whom. And so, one of man's greatest inventions was created: writing. The earliest forms of writing, such as cuneiform writing in Mesopotamia, began as a practical tool for keeping records, but soon became a medium for capturing ideas, beliefs, and stories. Writing made it possible to preserve and pass on knowledge through generations. It was no longer necessary for everyone to remember everything. It was enough to write it down. This opened the way to education, books, science, philosophy, and history. People could learn from the past and build on the knowledge of their ancestors. Scripture has become the memory of all mankind and the key to the future. We have come a long way since the first tool we used to break bones. People began to create more and more complex technologies. Gradually, they discovered metals, learned to process copper, bronze, and later iron. Each new discovery brought changes. A better plow meant a higher harvest. Metal tools made it possible to build cities and temples. Weapons gave superiority in battle. But technology was not just a tool for survival. It became a tool for reshaping the world. People began to change the landscape, cut down forests, build dams, run canals. For the first time in history, nature began to give way to the human will. And while these were often pragmatic steps, they had profound consequences. The idea arises that man does not only stand in the middle of the world, but is its master. This approach has led us all the way to the modern age. As civilizations expanded and cities grew, people began to create networks that extended far beyond their homes. Trade has become a major force connecting diverse groups of people. At first, it was an exchange of goods: grain for tools, cattle for cloth, salt for gold. Gradually, trade turned into a complex network of relationships, where it was no longer just about survival, but about wealth, influence, and prestige. If you are fascinated by this journey, like the video, subscribe and help spread the story of humanity. Thank you.